This was Hong Kong just 4 years ago.
As tens of thousands march in the heat for the 7th weekend straight, frustration is rising.
Millions of people took to the street to protest against the CCP and to fight for Hong Kong's freedom.
Tension turned to turmoil at the Hong Kong legislature.
People of Hong Kong try to fight for war to gain the basic human rights.
So, we need to stand for what we want and keep going on.
The number of protesters kept growing by the day. The movement reached every corner of the world. And it seemed like, for the first time in forever, that the will of the people may actually win.
They have been corrupting our system for a very long time, and they taking back many of our rights.
咁我會覺得今日咁樣嘅公民抗命係證明咗香港人。
Well, people are afraid. People are also angry about this extradition treaty. So everyone is coming out, not just Hong Kongers.
Once we are using the quote, if we burn, you burn with us.
Then we all kind of just forgot about it. But the CCP and Xi Jinping didn't. In fact, this provided Xi with the perfect opportunity to do what he always wanted. Ever since then, the CCP just kept chipping away at Hong Kong freedom and independence. In fact, this operation was so successful that in June of 2022, just 2 years after the protests, Xi Jinping held a victory parade in Hong Kong, celebrating CCP's victory against Hong Kong's freedom fighters. During a small speech, he said that after the wind and rain, Hong Kong has risen from the ashes. What he really meant was that all of the resistance to China's central government rule was knocked down. So today, let's go over how the CCP took over Hong Kong, while the whole world was distracted. Before we start, YouTube was recently ordered to block Hong Kong protest videos in May of 2024. But at the end of the day, people not talking about what's going on in Hong Kong makes the CCP's life a lot easier. So I'm sure this video is not going to fare well in the algorithm, so if you can just take a second and hit that like button below, it'll help me out tremendously. Thanks so much, guys. Now, let's start with the obvious question. Why did this territory have an independent government from China in the first place? The story actually begins in the 19th century, where the Chinese emperor agreed that Britain could lease an area on the Chinese coast. Or rather, the emperor really had little choice in the matter. The concession of these coastal territories was forced into the peace treaty after the First and Second Opium Wars. Basically, Britain was selling drugs to the Chinese, and the Chinese emperor didn't appreciate this. The addiction problem was getting out of hand, because eventually 90 million out of the 300 million Chinese were hooked on opium. On top of that, the opium imports were causing a significant economic drain. China and Britain fought 2 wars over this drug trade, and in the second one, France also joined the fight against China. Because the Western militaries had a military edge, they were winning the war and could enforce their terms in the peace treaty. At the end of the First Opium War in 1842, Britain took control over Hong Kong Island. On the 1st of July, 1898, after the Second Opium War, the British got a 99-year lease on Hong Kong Island and the surrounding new territories. Before this period of British rule, the area was far from the metropolis as we know it today. It was mostly occupied by fishermen, and there was some small-scale trade. This all changed in the 19th and 20th century, though. Hong Kong's population skyrocketed, from a few thousand to more than 6 million. The city became an international trade hub and one of the most prominent cities in East Asia. This was due to its free port and its connections with the rest of the vast British Empire. In its first years, Hong Kong remained an open opium port, But it was also a trade hub for tea and silk. After a brief but disastrous period of Japanese occupation during World War II, the colony returned to Britain. Where the mainland of China was still struggling under communist rule, Hong Kong's free market economy could make progress much faster. In the 1950s, the area had booming textile industry, and later it also became an electronics exporter. Hong Kong was one of the 4 Asian tigers, together with South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, who made rapid economic progress between 1950 and 1990. This period of British rule has a lasting impact until today, as the English language and parts of Western culture remain in the city. But we should also mention the downsides of the colonial era. Not everyone was happy with colonial rule, and there was a lot of social unrest. There were riots in 1956, 1966, 1967, and 1981. Hong Kong was the last substantial British colony, and many felt that the days of European colonialism were over. When the lease was coming to an end in 1997, Britain agreed to return the city to China. There was only one problem, though. China was ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. The authoritarian ideology of the Chinese government could be a threat to the people of Hong Kong. That's why the UK struck a deal with the then paramount leader, Jiang Zemin, to secure 50 years of free market capitalism and political freedoms in the city. This came at a time when the socialist market economy started to come up in China, and various special economic zones were created. So the economic freedoms that Hong Kong enjoyed weren't that unique, but what stood out was the political status of the territory. Until 2047, the city will have its own legislative, executive, and judicial powers. This includes its own currency, financial policies, education system, etc. The separate political system is formulated in the Basic Law, Hong Kong's own mini-constitution. It says that the Hong Kong government should eventually be selected by free and fair elections. There was one provision, though. The implementation of this democracy should follow the quote-unquote principle of gradual and orderly progress. Through mechanisms like an election committee, Hong Kong was never a true democracy. And over the last decades, it's become clear that it never will be. The CCP has been chipping away at the city's unique freedoms, and Hong Kongers got less and less say over their own government. But before we go into how the CCP is enforcing its control over Hong Kong, we first need to understand why it gave the city its freedom in the first place. After all, Beijing had the right to just take over the territory in one go back in 1997. But the independence of Hong Kong actually has benefits for the mainland. The city is the international gateway for China, for foreign investment and finance. In 2022, more than 70% of China's utilized foreign direct investment came from Hong Kong, reaching $137 billion in a single year. This has gained steam over the last 2 decades. Now, these billions aren't coming from Hong Kong itself. With a GDP of $360 billion, it can't possibly send $137 billion a year worth of investments to China. Most of the money actually comes from financial institutions based in other countries who use Hong Kong as a conduit for China. This has to do with Hong Kong's unique financial system. Although Singapore overtook it in 2022, it used to be Asia's financial hub and the 3rd biggest financial center in the world. The reason it's so popular is that the city has its own financial regulations and currency, which makes it attractive for foreign investors. Both institutions and retail investors prefer not to put their money directly into China because of the risks associated with it. It's not really a free market economy, so there's always the chance that the CCP intervenes. Also, the Chinese government doesn't really welcome foreign investors on the mainland. In order to invest directly, you need licenses, such as the Qualified Foreign Institutional Investor. And even after you obtain such a license after a long, bureaucratic process, you are still subject to strict CCP guidelines. Because this is such a hassle, much of the investment goes through the Hong Kong Stock Connect and Bond Connect markets. These are financial schemes for Hong Kong investors, which make it easy to access the Shenzhen and Shanghai stock exchanges and China's debt markets. What makes Hong Kong even more appealing as a financial gateway is the currency situation. In order to buy Chinese yuan-denominated assets with US dollars, going through Hong Kong is by far the easiest way. The Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, which makes transactions very stable. Meanwhile, the Chinese yuan and the US dollar aren't fully convertible due to capital restrictions. However, it's possible to transfer your US dollars into Hong Kong dollars and then convert them into Chinese yuan in Hong Kong. This setup is all on purpose, of course. For the Chinese government, it's a way to get foreign cash without being directly exposed to international currency markets. This shields it from a lot of financial instability and potential crises. Hong Kong's strategic location in the Greater Bay Area, the GBA in short, only helps with its function as an international bank for China. The area houses around 86 million people, with a combined GDP of around $1.9 trillion. This includes the third and fifth biggest cities in China by GDP, namely Guangzhou and Shenzhen. There are a lot of booming enterprises nearby, and all of them need investment and loans to keep growing. This financial incentive was one of the main reasons why the CCP didn't completely take over the city in 1997. As a strategic conduit, Hong Kong has been one of the key drivers of China's economic rise over the past decades. However, Hong Kong's political freedoms didn't fit into China's interests. Perhaps it was too dangerous for the CCP to have a beacon of free speech and democracy right next door, as the citizens in the mainland could get dangerous ideas. In 1991, Hong Kong held its first legislative election, in preparation of the split with the UK. There were two camps in this election, the pro-democracy side, pushing for more democratic reforms, and the pro-Beijing side, which sought closer ties with the mainland and the CCP. The pro-democracy side won in a landslide. The biggest party was the United Democrats of Hong Kong, led by Martin Lee, aka the father of democracy. Slowly but surely, though, the pro-Beijing camp began to gain political power, and it wasn't exactly fair play. To understand this, we have to look a bit closer at Hong Kong's political system after 1997. The most important man in Hong Kong is the chief executive, in some ways similar to the president in the US. But there's one big difference. The chief executive isn't chosen through a popular vote, but via an election committee. And only part of this committee is elected by the people. The rest of the committee consists of representatives from various sectors, businesses, professional groups, and political organizations. In other words, a mix of special interest groups. The same holds true for Hong Kong's Legislative Council, the LegCo, in short. This council approves laws and budgets and keeps the executive branch of the government in check, kind of similar to the US Congress. But the LegCo is also fundamentally different in how it's elected. Under the initial electoral system, 10 out of 60 seats were determined by the same election committee we talked about earlier. Half of the seats were chosen by functional constituencies, a group of representatives from special interest groups. Only 20 out of the 60 seats were actually voted on by the public. To this day, non-elected representatives have a lot of influence on the elections. This whole setup might sound a bit vague, but that's exactly the point. It has created an intentional loophole for the CCP to get political say in Hong Kong. You see, many businessmen and sectors are on the pro-Beijing side. And it's no wonder. China is Hong Kong's main trading partner, and Hong Kong is a nation dependent on trade. Trade in goods and services flowing through the country is worth nearly 4 times GDP. Many of the non-elected representatives from businesses and professions benefit from this. With their political power, they're obviously choosing a pro-establishment candidate. We should also take into account that it's much easier to influence these special interest groups compared to normal voters. The CCP does this through the Hong Kong Liaison Office, which is the party's hub in the city. The building looks like you'd expect it to, a big glass and concrete tower straight out of George Orwell's 1984. The office is responsible for promoting the mainland's interests, and it has very close ties with special interest groups and pro-Beijing politicians. It organizes and funds the major pro-establishment parties, and it manages their electoral campaigns. The liaison office even owns various media outlets, including 3 pro-Beijing newspapers and Hong Kong's biggest book publishing company. However, its most important job is lobbying the non-elected representatives to vote for the pro-Beijing party. There's a severe lack of transparency, so this could involve offering economic incentives or possibly even just bribes. The effects of this flawed electoral system showed in the 1998 legislative election. The pro-democracy side won 2/3 of the popular vote, but only got 1/3 of the seats. The following elections had similar results, where the government wasn't really representing what the people voted for. A lot of people got frustrated because of this, since the Hong Kong Basic Law promises a true democracy sometime in the future. When it looked like the CCP wouldn't allow that to happen, the clashes began. There were already annual protests with the July 1st marches, marking the day of the handover to China. But in 2023, it got to a whole nother level. 500,000 people took part in that year's march. This was because the pro-Beijing government tried to implement new security laws, making acts of treason and secession against the CCP illegal. Because of the immense pushback, the law was put on hold and didn't get implemented that year. But in 2005, things got heated again. The pro-Beijing government tried to implement a new electoral system, which honestly didn't change much. The representatives would hold their power and nothing was really done to achieve a democracy. The pro-democracy side demanded more than just a facade. In December of 2005, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in protest of this. Ultimately, the proposed reform didn't get passed, partially because of public pressure. This only postponed the problem, though, as the public still didn't have the electoral reform it was promised. China intended to keep it that way for a while. In 2007, it ruled that Hong Kong couldn't directly elect its leaders until 2017, and its legislative council until 2020. The pro-democracy and pro-Beijing parties, together with the liaison office, entered long talks to see what could be achieved. But some legislators were fed up with the way things were going and resigned in order to trigger an election. They saw this as a de facto referendum, in order to let the people voice their opinion on democracy. The plan kind of failed, with a low voter turnout and criticism from the other parties. There seemed to be some slight progress in 2010 with a new electoral reform that actually passed. More sectors were represented in the election committee, and through direct and district-based voting, people got more electoral power over the LegCo. But this reform was more of an appeasement than actual democracy. The following elections had similar results, because the non-elected representatives continued to have a large say. Still, the people of Hong Kong had hope that democracy would eventually come in 2017. That is, until August of 2014. The CCP revealed its proposal for the 2017 chief executive election, and it was quite disappointing. Basically, the people of Hong Kong would be allowed to directly choose their preferred candidate, except that each candidate needs approval from a new committee. This committee was a similar idea as the election committee, as it consisted of the same special interest groups. It had people representing businesses, professions, communities, and political groups. There were even people tied to the CCP in this committee. Basically, you had the same system guaranteeing CCP influence, only in a different format. This angered many people and triggered the 2014 Umbrella Movement. For months on end, starting in September, students blocked major roads and intersections in protest. But this is the movement where the pro-Beijing government showed its true face. The police used tear gas on the protesters. The pro-Beijing side even used criminal gangs to attack dissidents in what are called triad attacks. This was a watershed moment, which turned the political debate into a conflict. Many young people turned against the government. Meanwhile, the pro-Beijing camp saw the protest as a violation of the rule of law, instigated by Western actors. Legislators understood the public pressure, though, and opted out of the proposed electoral reform. Once again, nothing much changed, and the government remained close to the CCP. There was a return to stability for the next few years, but none of the divisions were solved. It was bound to go wrong again, which it did in 2019. The Hong Kong government proposed a controversial extradition bill, allowing for fugitives to be transferred to China, Macau, and Taiwan. What this really meant was that the enemies of the CCP could expect to spend the rest of their life in a Chinese prison. Basically, an extradition agreement would mean that people in Hong Kong are subject to the CCP's laws. Because this absolutely demolished any hopes of free speech, many students took to the streets again, and others followed. The first pro-democracy protests began in March of 2019. and they continued for more than a year. On several occasions, hundreds of thousands of people were protesting at the same time. The biggest protest occurred on the 16th of June 2019, where organizers estimated 2 million people went to the streets. That would be about 30% of the entire city's population. One of the most violent protests was the storming of the Legislative Council complex in July of 2019. People broke through glass walls and doors and entered the government building in order to prevent the extradition bill from being passed. The damage done during the storming led to a shutdown of the complex for 3 months. They succeeded in their objective as the chief executive announced the bill was quote-unquote dead, and it was delayed indefinitely. Even though the immediate threat of the extradition bill was over, the protests continued. With the momentum build up, people demonstrated for other demands too. There were 5 to be precise. The first one had to do with the definitive withdrawal of the extradition bill, so that the legislative process couldn't be resumed. Protesters also wanted the current chief executive to resign and a new directly elected government. The third and fourth demands were accountability for the police behavior during the protests and the release of protesters arrested due to their political beliefs. Additionally, they demanded that peaceful protests shouldn't be treated as riots by the government. Inspired by the Baltic Way protests of 1989, where people in the Baltic states formed a human chain of 2 million people, Hong Kongers organized the Hong Kong Way protest. In August of 2019, an estimated 210,000 people formed a chain of more than 30 miles, about 50 kilometers. Because of the large backing among students, there were also huge protests on university campuses. This created clashes between student protesters and riot police at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. The last one was occupied by the pro-democracy camp, which led to a police siege and storming. Protesters threw bricks and petrol bombs, and the police used tear gas and rubber bullets. There were also cases of police brutality, exactly the thing people were protesting against. An example of this was the Prince Edward Metro Station incident, where the police indiscriminately attacked passengers and arrested protesters. Still, there were also people opposed to the protesters and in favor of the government. They organized pro-Beijing protests, such as the Safeguard Hong Kong rally. Some were wearing blue ribbons in support of the police force. The two groups of protesters often clashed. People tore down pro-democracy posters and graffiti. One extremist even attacked protesters with a knife. Others rammed their cars into crowds of demonstrators. There were also instances where villagers and supposed gang members ambushed groups with wooden sticks and metal rods. The most well-known incident was the 2019 Yuan Long attack, where a group of men in white t-shirts attacked protesters at a metro station, causing tens of injuries. They could have been vigilante groups who felt that the police weren't hard-handed enough, but the more likely explanation is that these people were hired by the pro-Beijing camp. Either way, it was clear whose side the police were on. Despite 24,000 emergency calls, the police force didn't show up on time and made no arrests. But in all fairness, the pro-democracy side was also not innocent. A pro-Beijing lawmaker called Junius Ho was stabbed and his family's graves desecrated. This was allegedly a retaliation for the Yuan Long attacks, where the lawmaker would have played a role. And apolitical citizens of Hong Kong were also victims. A 70-year-old resident died because of a fatal head injury when pro-democracy protesters were throwing bricks. Amidst all this chaos, Hong Kong held local elections in November of 2019. Many people saw this as a referendum about the extradition bill. The voter turnout was record-breaking, with 71% of registered voters casting their vote. And the pro-democracy parties won with a historical landslide. They got nearly 90% of the total seats in the direct elected district council, with 388 out of 452 seats. The following COVID pandemic drew the attention away for a few months, but in May of 2020, perhaps the most important development of all happened. Following the election result, the Chinese authorities began drafting a new law to be implemented in the Hong Kong Basic Law. And yes, the CCP can actually do that. There's some sort of intentional loophole where China can add a law to Hong Kong's constitution by way of promulgation. Sounds complicated, but it's actually relatively simple. When the chief executive publishes the new legislator in the government newspaper, the law is immediately in effect. There's no voting process, and the chief executive is always a pro-Beijing politician by design. So that's exactly what happened on the 21st of May, 2020. Suddenly, there was a new national security law, which made secession, foreign interference, terrorism, and subversion against the central government illegal. In other words, it gave the CCP and the pro-Beijing government more than enough room to arrest and criminalize any opposition. By the way, the CCP already tried to get this law through in 2003, right in the middle of the SARS outbreak. Funny how it always pushes these things during like a novel coronavirus outbreak. Perhaps it gives an excuse to prevent mass protests, as it will be a public health hazard. Anyway, with these new powers at their disposal, the pro-Beijing government and the CCP continued with their crackdown on opposition. In the next legislative election, 12 candidates for the pro-democracy side were banned. According to a government spokesman, they sought secession from China and intervention from foreign governments. With the new national security law, those things have become illegal. The Chinese authorities went even further in November of 2020. They passed a new resolution saying that the Hong Kong executives can remove legislators in the Legislative Council. 4 sitting pro-democracy legislators were immediately disqualified, and their 15 colleagues resigned in protest. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong authorities used the national security law to crack down on activists and protesters. Since the imposition of the law, 299 people have been arrested. This includes a lot of high-profile people, who were obviously the first target of the CCP. Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow, both activists turned politicians, had to spend some time in jail for violating national security. Another arrest which made headlines all over the world is that of Jimmy Lai. He was a businessman and politician, and one of the most powerful pro-democracy figures in the whole city. Jimmy Lai got rich with a clothing retail company and moved into the media business later. His media company, Next Digital, became the largest media company in Hong Kong, largely due to the popular Apple Daily newspaper. This news outlet was very critical of the Chinese government, as was Jimmy Lai. The billionaire was one of the main donors to the Democratic Party in Hong Kong. Lai was obviously a big target for the CCP, and he was arrested in 2020 and jailed in 2021. As of writing this video, he's been locked up for 3 years and is facing a life sentence. When the leaders of the resistance movement are removed and jailed, the rest of the protesters lose confidence. In this way, the CCP managed to crush any hopes of a return to democracy. With the reduced public resistance, Beijing's plan continued. Before the 2021 legislative elections, the Chinese authorities made some sweeping reforms. Only quote-unquote patriots loyal to China could run, and the number of directly elected seats was drastically reduced. Only 20 out of the 90 seats could be chosen by the people, and the directly elected district councils had significantly less powers in the new system. Now it was clear to everyone, Hong Kong wasn't a democracy anymore, but a vassal state to the CCP. For the last 3 years or so, this situation continued. In June of 2022, Xi Jinping visited Hong Kong for the 25th anniversary of the handover. But it was also something like a victory parade for him, since the political opposition was effectively stopped. It was also his first visit outside of mainland China after the start of the COVID pandemic. During a small speech, he said that, "After the wind and the rain, Hong Kong has risen from the ashes." What he really meant was that all of the resistance to China's central government rule was knocked down. A few days later, Xi Jinping was there at the inauguration of the new chief executive. This was after a sham election, with a voter turnout of just 30% and only pro-Beijing candidates. In his inauguration speech, Xi Jinping said that he was happy only patriots could hold office in Hong Kong. The pro-Beijing government continued its crackdown on opposition, arresting tons of people. In 2024, people are still being prosecuted for their involvement in the 2019 protests. Many activists fled the country, but even there, they weren't safe. The Hong Kong police have offered $1 million Hong Kong in bounties for 5 activists overseas. As if the current legislation wasn't effective enough in silencing opposition, the Hong Kong legislators passed another national security law in March of 2024. It's called Article 23, and it's even more authoritarian than the previous one. When people are convicted of treason, insurrection, and sabotage together with external actors, they can now get a life sentence in jail. Collusion with external forces for any other crime gives you 2 to 3 years. Espionage and sabotage can be punished with up to 20 years in prison, and inciting hatred against the CCP is now punished with a 10-year imprisonment. The last one is perhaps the most dangerous of all, as it's the vaguest, and can be applied to everyone disagreeing with the party. If we look into the future, the picture is also not very bright. The one country, two systems framework will come to an end in 2047, exactly 50 years after the handover to China. As flawed and dysfunctional as it is, the two systems idea was arguably better than direct CCP rule, and it doesn't look like the CCP will grant Hong Kong an additional few years of self-governance. Because of the increased competition with the US, Beijing has become less tolerant towards things like democracy and free speech. The risk that an independent Hong Kong will align itself with the US is just too big. So, with the knowledge that Hong Kong has only 23 years left, there are only two things that the city's inhabitants can do. They can either flee using a British visa program, or they can wait and see what life is like under an authoritarian regime.